Without further ado, we're going to listen to a craft lecture from Talene Monahon.
Hi, everyone. It's such a thrill and an honor and a mild terror to be up here. This is my second time at Sewanee, and I feel so grateful for this space and this community. I really cherish it, so thank you for coming out today to talk about history in the theater and the delights and the dilemmas of portraying the past in the present. I'm going to start off by reading my favorite quote about history, which is from an essay written by the late author Hilary Mantel, who is not a playwright as far as I know, but she wrote, "Facts are not truth, though they are a part of it. Information is not knowledge, and history is not the past. It is the method we have evolved of organizing our ignorance of the past." So, like many writers, I look to the past for the spores of a story. I enjoy taking ownership over a history, stewarding facts within my own form, and offering my personalized variant to an audience. I think it could have happened like this. Maybe it did happen like this. Writing like that within a historical framework makes me feel very powerful, and it also makes me feel really anxious. History is as combustible as it is kaleidoscopic. As Nicole Hannah-Jones writes in the 1619 Project, while history is what happened, it is also just as important how we think about what happened and what we unearth and choose to remember about what happened. So, obviously, there are vicious battles being fought across the country over what sort of history is taught, who's writing that history, who is centered in that history, and crucially, what does our understanding of that history mean about us today, in this moment? These questions are not unique to our country, of course. As an Armenian American, I've often armchair self-analyzed that perhaps my own interest in the fallibility of the historical record stems from a lifelong struggle with the systemic denial of the Armenian genocide and the subsequent threat of erasure. Maybe because of this, maybe for no particular reason, I feel consumed by history and by these recurring questions about how particular histories are told. I wonder what these questions mean when considering historical fiction. And more specifically, what do these questions mean when considering historical fiction in the theater? So, I want to explore today a little bit how history lives on the page and how it's translated to the stage. How do we care for it? How do we act responsibly? These questions obviously obsess me, and today I'm going to discuss them all at once using some plays you may know, some plays you may not, some plays that I listed in my course description, some plays that I didn't list in my course description. There are plays that I listed in my course description that I'm not going to talk about. There's also plays that I wrote that I'm going to talk about, plays that I wrote and how I've kind of dealt with some of these questions or tried to deal with them. Hilary Mantel also wrote, "If we want to meet the dead looking alive, we turn to art." I might go one step further. If we want to meet the dead inhabiting live bodies before our very eyes, we turn to theater. And to me, there is no more seminal work of American historical theater than Arthur Miller's The Crucible. I'm going to talk a lot about The Crucible today. Written over 70 years ago now, The Crucible has come to occupy a unique and rarefied place in our nation's collective imagination. Miller's script portrays the Salem witch trials of 1692 through the lens of John Proctor, a righteous farmer. Proctor's conscience is haunted by the extramarital affair he had with 17-year-old Abigail Williams, who becomes the ringleader of the teenage girls hurling witchcraft accusations. Proctor speaks out against Abigail and her crew, only to be accused of witchcraft himself and, spoiler, hanged at the gallows. The year the play premiered on Broadway, Miller published an article in the New York Times in which he wrote, "The Crucible is taken from history. No character is in the play who did not take a similar role in Salem 1692. So I first encountered The Crucible when I was 11 years old, attending a performance at the local high school. I don't remember much, only that I was dazzled by the emotive spectacle put on by the 16-year-old boy playing John Proctor. Perhaps a coincidence that 20 years later I would start dating a wonderful professional actor who was also a former high school John Proctor, and I'm lucky to have a clip here for you. just gives you a taste of, like, in case no one has seen The Crucible at a high school, this is...
I'm not worth the dust on the feet of them that hang. How may I live now my name is in you, my soul?
So, yeah, that's my boyfriend. Older, he's older now. So I went on to read The Crucible in my 8th grade U.S. history class as a supplement to our brief curriculum on the Salem witch trials. For many years thereafter, I took for granted that The Crucible was an accurate account of the history of Salem in 1692. The story of a virtuous man wrongly put to death, and the story of a band of manipulative, attention-seeking teenage girls led by a malicious town hussy, which is what the original New York Times review originally described Abigail as. So that's what I believe actually happened. So The Crucible does a funny thing, right? Like, because of its status as, you know, an appealing stage vehicle for a large cast, and as a rich text studied in English and history classes alike, the play remains, like, pretty ubiquitous, I think, as far as I know, in American high schools. And for decades, teenagers have been fed Miller's play in the same curriculums in which they consume histories of the Revolutionary War, the Great Depression, the Emancipation Proclamation. Subsequently, more than any other play I can think of, The Crucible has merged with actual historical record, I think, in the collective imagination. It has sort of become our history of that time period. And as an example of this, the language of the play has seeped into popular culture. The expression witch hunt has become favored language by the former president and the American right at large, deployed often whenever a powerful man has been accused of wrongdoing, particularly within the context of the Me Too movement. In 1692 Salem, only 2 of the 19 people who were hanged were women, and they were predominantly elderly women. Sorry, I said that wrong. 2 were men. The rest were women. They were elderly women. But today, when the term witch hunt is used colloquially in op-eds, in Twitter, and Fox News, it is almost always used to describe a man who has been the target of accusations, right? It's hard to imagine, I think, that this would be the case if Miller had not so vividly and honestly very compellingly told the story of the most famous witch hunt in America in these terms. A good man falsely accused a group of teenage girls motivated by malice. So I think it's likely that Miller, who was a lifelong Democrat, would be horrified by the pervasiveness with which crucibilized language is deployed in right-wing politics. He famously had politics of different ilk on the brain while writing the play. I have a picture of him. Sorry, I didn't mean to play this again. There we go, there he is. So famously very handsome. While he was writing The Crucible, he was consumed with McCarthyism and the trials held by the House Un-American Activities. In his 1996 New Yorker essay entitled Why I Wrote The Crucible, Miller observed, "The more I read into the Salem Panic, the more it touched off corresponding images of common experiences in the 50s. The old friend of a blacklisted person crossing the street to avoid being seen talking to him, the overnight conversions of former leftists into born-again patriots, and so on. Apparently, certain processes are universal. When Gentiles in Hitler's Germany, for example, saw their Jewish neighbors being trucked off, or farmers in Soviet Ukraine saw the kulaks vanishing before their eyes, the common reaction, even among those unsympathetic to Nazism or communism, was quite naturally to turn away in fear of being identified with the condemned." So Miller was writing not only about the past, but the present. He was commenting on Salem, but Salem as an analogy, as a means of commenting on the current reality, his current reality of the Red Scare, and about authoritarianism and conformity in general. But what about the actual history of Salem? And what about this question of history in the theater and what it means when facts mingle with imagination? So in the same 1996 essay, Why I Wrote the Crucible, Miller describes a key moment in his creative process, which occurred while he was researching the history of the Salem witch trials. He quotes a moment from the witchcraft trial transcript in which Abigail Williams and another girl are testifying against Elizabeth Proctor, who was the wife of John Proctor. This is the quote that Miller was reading to start with. Both made offer to strike at said Proctor, but when Abigail's hand came near, it opened, whereas made up into a fist before, and came down exceedingly lightly as it drew near to said Proctor, and at length, with open and extended fingers, touched Proctor's hood very lightly. Immediately, Abigail cried out, her fingers burned. So then Miller continues. These are his words. In this remarkably observed gesture of a troubled young girl, I believed a play became possible. Elizabeth Proctor had been the orphaned Abigail's mistress, and they had lived together in the same small house until Elizabeth fired the girl. By this time, I was sure John Proctor had bedded Abigail, who had to be dismissed, most likely to appease Elizabeth. So I was in my 20s when I learned that Abigail Williams, the girl who Miller so confidently asserts John Proctor had bedded, was actually 11 years old at the time of the trials. John Proctor himself, who was indeed Abigail Williams' employer at the time, was in reality 60 years old in 1692. Contemplating what happened in Salem suddenly felt really different when I considered a young child having uncontrollable fits rather than a nearly adult woman acting with intent, drunk on power and lust. Now, I'm not the first person to have this realization by far. Over the years, many people have called into question the accuracy of what Miller portrayed. In 1994, Wendy Schissel wrote an article entitled Rediscovering the Witches in Arthur Miller's The Crucible, a Feminist Reading. She writes, in order to make Abigail's seductive capability more believable and John's culpability less pronounced, Miller has deliberately raised Abigail's age from 12 to 17. He introduces us to John and Abigail in the first act with John's acknowledgement of her young age. Abby, the diminutive form of her name is not to be missed, is understandably annoyed. How dare you call me child? Despite Abigail's allegations, Miller achieves the curious effect of making her the apparent aggressor in this scene. In Sarah Ruhl's play, Becky, Nurse of Salem, she addresses these concerns explicitly and head-on. The titular character, a tour guide in modern-day Salem, begins the show with an aggrieved summary of the crucible. Literally, these are like the first words in the show. She says to the audience, now, in the play, the reason Abigail wanted to get revenge on John Proctor's pregnant wife, this is what I could never really wrap my head around, is that this girl wants to fuck an old man. Sorry, sleep with. In the play, Abigail was 17, but in real life, she was 11. Fact. And in the play, he's like, you whore, stop tempting me. And I'm like, she's 11. More likely that John Proctor courted Abigail. So Sarah Ruhl she starts off with that. My play, The Good John Proctor, that's Brittany Allen. Woo woo! Is a sort of prequel to The Crucible, and it imagines the four girls at the center of the trial the year before they begin the accusations. Similarly to Ruhl, I felt compelled to re-enter the history of Salem from a different angle and to envision the girls as actual children experiencing a traumatic and repressive society. I was curious about what that might do to my understanding of these events. As I developed The Good John Proctor, I explored the court transcripts of the trials and the texts of Reverend Parris's sermons. I also read the massively well-researched book, The Witches by Stacy Schiff, which I would recommend. Here and there, a description or a detail would bounce in my eye, how unimaginably dark the night was in 1692 Salem, the frequency of violence used against servants, the tendency of church members to speak in testimony all the time, and the daily activities of servant girls, such as butter churning, cleaning, or candle making. Also this sentence from The Witches, the Massachusetts Puritan also knew or devoutly hoped that he was being watched. I really loved that. So as I wrote the play, I returned again and again to the notes I had compiled, but I also found the voices of the girls merging with the voices of my sister's children, who were 9 and 11, whom I had nannied for during COVID. And so I felt this desire to bring accuracy to the history that I was reading, but also perhaps more so to bring accuracy to my own understanding of children and how they thought and how they operated. So those were sort of the things that I was toggling in the writing of the play. I was also engaged in a long-running dialogue about the Crucible and its themes with my friend Tavi Gevinson, who's a wonderful actor and writer. Tavi had starred as Mary Warren in the most recent Broadway revival of the Crucible, and she played Mercy Lewis in The Good John Proctor. And we had this long exchange about her fascination with the play and her own experience in it. A thing she wrote me in the email about her experience was, she said, "I found the piece endlessly fascinating and rewarding, but I had terrible insomnia and was on vocal rest, and there's some symmetry there too, to the character's voicelessness, I guess. What does it do to your brain when you don't speak aloud for months except to say things like, 'You're the devil's man'?" So last summer, brimming with Crucible curiosity, Tavi and I traveled to the Harry Ransom Center in Austin to investigate Arthur Miller's documents in the archives there. At the center, we were given access to Miller's essays, diaries, and the journals in which he first drafted The Crucible. The journals were an aggregation of sprawling notes from Miller's own historical research on Salem, interspersed with these scene snippets in which he sort of starts to imagine like how characters might speak to each other, a lot of which like doesn't end up in the play. It's just he's kind of brainstorming. So I read like Abigail and John Proctor talking to each other for the first time, and a scene between Betty and Abigail at night whispering to each other. It struck me that Miller's process in writing a historical play was not so dissimilar to my own. I have Google Docs that are filled with bullet points of facts and quotes, accompanied with notes to myself about plot ideas and character traits. And the first scene that I ever wrote of The Good John Proctor was a scene featuring Betty and Abby at night. So past and present seemed like really mixed up and merged, like always. Throughout his entries, Miller writes the names of the girls in the witch trials alongside their ages, over and over and over again. He writes Abigail Williams, 11, Mercy Lewis, 19, Betty Paris, 9, Mary Warren, 20. Over and over, he writes their names and their ages, like he's trying to make sense of them. And at some point in his journals, there's a shift. And he writes Mary Warren, 20, Mercy Lewis, 19, Abigail Williams, 15. And when I squinted looking at that page, I could see that the 5 in Abigail's age was bolded and smudged, like it had been written over a 1. 11 had been changed to 15, and later he would change it to 17. So you can actually see on the page where the smudge, like this smudge where history meets the imagination, where the past shifts within the present, and where fact becomes theater. In Miller's New Yorker essay, he wrote, "There are strange, even weird memories that have connected themselves to this play, and these have to do with the present, and it has all got mixed up together." So how much of the aim of a history play is to help us understand the past, to gain real knowledge about the moment a play is examining? Or is it like totally foolish to think that a play is about anything but the present? Can the past be anything more than a springboard or a filtered lens to examine the current moment? And this is the thing that I've been thinking a lot about, is that does a historical play owe a responsibility to its audience to acknowledge when facts have been changed by the author? Or does the genre of theater in and of itself just render such an explanation unnecessary? The spoiler is I don't have an answer for that. But it is not always clear to me when Miller is aware of his fancy falsifying facts. When he writes, "By this time I was sure John Proctor had bedded Abigail," does he mean that he is certain that the actual historical John Proctor had bedded the actual historical 11-year-old Abigail? Or does he mean that he is certain that his John Proctor had bedded his Abigail? That he is merely certain of the validity of this event as the dramatic catalyst of his own play? Is there a distinction between the surety of history and the surety of a story? Should he have been more explicit about the difference between the two? And would that have made a difference in the trajectory of the play as we know it? Okay, so Shakespeare's history plays, he wrote a lot of them. They refer to 10 of his 37 plays, which detail the reigns and the rises and the falls of English monarchs from King John to Henry VIII. Shakespeare wrote these plays under Queen Elizabeth, the last of the Tudors, and his stories appropriately glorify Elizabeth's Tudor ancestors while denigrating their challengers. Shakespeare's histories play loosely with historical record, often in service of Tudor propaganda, but often simply in pursuit of more compelling or more efficient storytelling. Shakespeare frequently condenses timelines to heighten the momentum of dramatic action. In Henry IV, he lowers the age of Prince Hal's rival Hotspur to make him Hal's peer, which sort of accentuates the competition between the two of them, whereas in reality, Hotspur was like 20 years older than Hal. In Richard III, ghastly Google image of Benedict Cumberbatch. Shakespeare turns the title character into the personification of evil itself. And this interpretation is questioned by modern day historians who are dubious about a lot of things, from like how many deaths Richard was actually responsible for to like whether or not he actually had a hunchback, certainly anything that looks like that. But in 1594, it was really helpful politically for Shakespeare to villainize Richard as a means of cementing the rightful legacy of Queen Elizabeth to the throne, because it was, after all, her grandfather, Henry VII, who defeated Richard in the Battle of Bosworth, which secured her family's place to power. But again, I don't think politics were the only thing that Shakespeare was concerned about, obviously. He was just as compelled by the artistic opportunity to bring intimacy and introspection to villainy as he is by this professional obligation to make Richard a literal villain. Let's look at some very first lines of the play. Again, the very first lines of the play. Richard famously reflects, why I, in this weak piping time of peace, have no delight to pass away the time, unless to see my shadow in the sun and descant on my own deformity. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair well-spoken days, I'm determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. When the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, you may remember people became really obsessed with resurrecting a certain history, which went along the lines of like, oh, well, you know, Shakespeare wrote Lear during a pandemic, so, you know, some really beautiful things will be written during this time, which, as a writer, made me feel really resentful. Maybe some of you can relate. I felt like it was sort of a capitalist pressure to produce in the face of tragedy, but I also just found myself generally resentful of Shakespeare himself. James Baldwin wrote that every writer in the English language has at some point hated Shakespeare. And March 2020 was really that moment for me. But I also couldn't stop reading about him. In June of 2020, I stumbled across the text of this wild proto-feminist pamphlet entitled Jane Eyre, Her Protection for Women, which was published in 1589 in Elizabethan England, which is when Shakespeare was alive and writing. Suddenly, I was writing a history play. So in this play, Jane Eyre, I imagine Jane Eyre, the unknown writer of this pamphlet, as Shakespeare's Dark Lady of the Sonnets. Jane Eyre's pamphlet was actually published in 1589, but in my play, I pushed the date to 1606 to make Shakespeare more established and to set the scene during a historical plague outbreak where I could make pandemic jokes and push the characters all into quarantine together. I should say that no one knows that this pamphlet exists, but no one knows who Jane Eyre was. So it was sort of this like blank slate to be like, I'm going to imagine a character based off of this like agenda in this pamphlet. Later in the play, I changed history again when my character Jane Eyre, along with Shakespeare's hapless wife Anne Hathaway, cut off Shakespeare's arms and penis. So as a result, I don't think that any audience members left my play confusing the events on stage with historical fact. But I did hope that more people left knowing about the real Jane Eyre's funny and flaming writing than did before the performance. My co-teacher at Sewanee, David Atchme, wrote a brilliant play, Marie Antoinette, which traces the history of the infamous queen from youth to guillotine. A few scenes into his play, a sheep wanders on stage and speaks to Marie and warns Marie that the public is starting to turn against her. He also demands that she pet him. At this point in the play, Atchme has already been toying with historical accuracy through his use of dialogue. Consider the first few lines of the play, an exchange between Marie and her friends Polignac and Lamballe. David? Okay. I'm gonna, forgive me. I'm gonna read it. Okay. So Polignac is pouring tea. She says, tea? And Marie says, thanks, I'll have a spot. Oh my God, I'm picking up British affectations. I'll have a spot. And Lamballe says, and look what's happening in the colonies. Boston, I know, Bedlam. It's crazy, and all for a spot of tea. So the critic Hilton Alls wrote of Marie Antoinette, ooh, I'm a little off. There we go. Right off, we know that Ajmi's Marie isn't Marie. Her language isn't in the tradition of stage royals, particularly as imagined by American actors performing the classics. Rather, we're in something more modern, in movie territory, actually. And Ajmi's Marie is fending off the machinations of Mean Girls by being stupid and thus not a threat. Ajmi's brilliance is to use trashy vernacular speech to allude to the way history trashes us. Back to Shakespeare for a minute. There are a few times when Shakespeare actually does speak directly to his dubious authority on the historical record and of the distortions that come with artistic license. At the end of Henry V, a chorus proclaims, thus far with rough and all unable pen, our bending author hath pursued the story in little room, confining mighty men, mingling by starts the full course of their glory. So mingling by starts, I think, is a little false humility in my opinion, but Shakespeare's placing this acknowledgement within the text of the history play itself is like deeply powerful to me. And it reminds me of the way that Lloyd Suh, who is a former Sewanee professor, plays with the limits of historical truth-telling within his brilliant play, The Chinese Lady. The Chinese Lady imagines the life of Afong Moy, a Chinese teenager who traveled to the United States in 1834 and performed as a cultural curiosity and a living exhibit with P.T. Barnum. So described his process writing the play in an interview. He wrote, the history of Afong Moy was lost to us. She disappeared, she was forgotten, she was discarded. But I had begun to revere her, to see her as a very important part of American history, of history in general, world history, human history. I didn't want to be in the position of making stuff up, so I put it away for a little while. But Afong Moy continued to haunt me. I sat with this question of why was she forgotten, and then I started to think about the reasons she was forgotten being still with us today. In his play, So reckons with these questions head on. The characters speak in the moment, but also out of time and space. They have a knowledge of their own lack of knowledge. In one of her many speeches to the voyeuristic audience, Afong Moy remarks, the reason Britain wanted to conquer China was, of course, trade routes. And the most important reason was to control trade routes, of course, is the price of tea. Of course, I do not know any of this. At least not right now in 1837 when the Opium Wars are beginning, when I'm only 17 years old and so shielded from news of the world. I do not know that I do not know this either. At another point in the play, Atung, Moy's older translator, reflects on how the act of translation is more similar to interpretation than literal recreation. He then goes a step further in his analysis, commenting, even as we play act our roles, this is but an interpretation. For this is not then. I can present to you a memory of someone, but it will only be a performance. The words you hear will not be theirs. The clothes I wear will not be theirs. The body that I occupy will not be theirs. Like cracks in a bell or a story when it first rang, we can only simulate the past, not in pursuit of the literal truth, but some other less tangible truth about ourselves and the nature of truth itself. It's similar to the act of translation. It's a fact, whether I like it or not. So history is the past, but I wonder how far away the past has to be in order to become history. Are there different rules when a story is a few centuries old versus a few years or a few months? Most of the past of history is regulated, of course, by who was doing the telling and, obviously who had access to reading and writing and a pen and paper and knowledge of what to do with it. For instance, the trial transcripts of the Salem witch trials are all recorded by Reverend Parris. We have no idea what he changed or what he omitted, just as we have no idea what the screaming girls felt about what was happening to them. Theater is a really wild medium. It's a very strange mix of realism and artifice. Unlike, say, a period piece like in a movie or a mini-series, in theater, it is inevitable and therefore fundamental to the art form that we see the seams, the unreality of what is before us. Even with the biggest budgets and the best executed stage magic, the fourth wall is always there to tip us off, that this is not really history, this is not really as it was. As Se notes through Attung, the clothes are not, they just can't be authentic. The bodies can't be authentic. It is all a simulation. So given that, what makes a play actually historical? How much accuracy of sets, of costumes, of props can there be? And what about accuracy of language, of characters speaking language as it was way back then, like they sort of do in Shakespeare, or like in The Crucible, speaking a language which is actually made up by Arthur Miller to sound like it was way back then? The genre of the docu-play takes accuracy of language to the extreme by offering plays created solely from found texts and interviews. Moises Kaufman's play Gross Indecency combines transcripts of the 3 trials of Oscar Wilde with journals and letters of Wilde and his peers. The play begins with an actor reading a quote from Wilde. "Do not be afraid of the past. If people tell you it is irrevocable, do not believe them. The past, present, and future are but one moment in the sight of God. Time and space are merely accidental conditions of thought. The imagination can transcend them." Which is a quote that reminds me of block universe theory, in which past, present, and future all exist simultaneously with equal validity. I sort of feel it feels apt to consider this theory within the context of historical drama, where historical events are recreated by live bodies in the present tense, but they are as much about the history being recreated as they are about the current moment and the performance, but also equally about the future of the play as a text and its future audience members and performers. Kaufman, reflecting on his process in creating Gross Indecency, wrote of the varied source material he was contending with. He wrote, "Each told a personal, sometimes very different story of what happened. It seemed to me that any legitimate attempt to reconstruct this historical event had to incorporate, in one way or another, the diversity of accounts. As soon as the actors began to personify historical characters, they brought to these portrayals their own histories, their own versions of who these characters were and what the conflict between them was about. I knew that the piece had to make that presence, the presence of the actor telling the story, visible." So as a result, Kaufman's play uses 9 actors to weave the story of Wilde's public downfall through multiple historical voices, often presenting clashing perspectives of contemporary newspapers and peers with different understandings of the same events. The playwright and actor Anna Devere Smith's work also hinges on the subjectivity of the individual, both the character and the performer. Smith remarked, "By its nature, art is a condensation and an acceleration of life. It is not life." And yet, Smith's work, composed of verbatim interviews that she herself conducted, which she recreates in solo performance, is engaged directly with real life. Smith's amazing play, Fires in the Mirror, examines the 1991 Crown Heights riots from the verbatim texts of over 50 interviews. In the original production of the play, Smith transformed herself on stage into a multitude of individuals of different ages, genders, and ethnicities, using very little other than her own body and voice. I think this is so brilliant. The text of this play, Fires in the Mirror, begins with the words of another playwright, Ntozake Shange, speaking to Smith about the meaning of identity. It's the first words you hear in the play, which I guess is something that I'm obsessed with because I'm reading a lot of first words in plays. But so this is what she says, and this is typically performed by Smith in performance. And it's a reflection on the meaning of identity. What's inside our identity is everything that's ever happened to us. Everything that's ever happened to us, as well as our responses to it. Because we might be alone in a trance state, someplace like the desert, and we begin to feel as though we are part of the desert. If we are part of the desert, which we are right at that minute, but we are not the desert, we are part of the desert, and when we go home, we take with us that part of the desert that the desert gave us, but we're still not the desert. It's an important differentiation to make because you don't know what you're giving if you don't know what you have, and you don't know what you're taking if you don't know what's yours and what's somebody else's. So in her work, Smith engages with the impossible problem of accuracy and identity in performance. By personally embodying every person she herself interviewed, Smith brings the utmost authenticity to the stage. She was there with these people when they spoke these words, and she's showing us what she heard and what she saw. Yet, in channeling every individual through nothing but her own body and voice, she's simultaneously dispelling this illusion of representation. Of course, she is not the exact archetype of each person. We would never assume that she was. So Smith is taking a part of the work home with her, but she knows, as Shange observes, what she has and what she does not have. Even in verbatim theater, there are limits to what is authentic and what can be known, and I think that acknowledgement right at the beginning of the play is such a beautiful launching pad for it. Okay, so I wrote an interview-based play called How to Load a Musket, in which I explored this interest that I've always had in historical storytelling from a different angle. I spent 6 years interviewing Revolutionary and Civil War reenactors and created a play from the verbatim texts of our conversations. I was curious about the hobby of reenacting, and similar to my thoughts on theater, about the ethical questions of who participated, who watched, and who decided which histories were being relived on the battlefield. Most historical reenactors will tell you that they strive for authenticity in clothing and weapons and the structure of a battle. And many reenactors spoke to me about the depth of their own personal research. This is an actor reenacting a reenactor who's one of the go-to George Washingtons in the metro area. And he said to me, as a child, I was always reading biographies of George Washington. When I was in 3rd, 4th grade, something that drew me to the person. Now I've read about 6 to 8 different biographies. The more I get to know the person, it's almost a personal fit with Washington's personality. Washington's more of a silent, quiet type of person. He doesn't like to be the center of attention. He had a very strong-willed mother who raised him. My mother was pretty strong-willed. I can empathize with that. So in the act of historical reenacting, it was often described to me by reenactors as a sort of time and space wormhole, one that allows reenactors to experience a moment of history as it actually happened, with nothing in sight to shatter the painstakingly executed illusion that they're not actually there in that moment hundreds of years ago. I was obviously really troubled by what that meant, particularly in the context of Civil War reenacting, where often the Confederate Army in battle is recreated by hundreds to thousands of people. I wondered how reenacting compared to theater. Was a person reenacting a Confederate soldier similar to a person playing Richard III? Was there an awareness of being on the wrong side of history, of playing the villain in the zigzagging moral arc of our nation's past? What I found, perhaps inevitably, was no, it was not the same. The Confederate reenactors I spoke with were frequently descended from actual Confederate soldiers. They described pursuing reenacting as a means of preserving their version of history, one that validated and humanized their forefathers. One Confederate reenactor told me, "Your general public doesn't know their history, and a lot of the general public wants to attack." Now, it's been going on for quite a while. People really going after almost anything Confederate, monuments. In Charlottesville, they've now voted to remove the monument of Robert E. Lee by the courthouse up there, okay? Angers me to no end. It's a genocide that's going on against my heritage. Not just my heritage, American history, trying to change American history. So as I worked on the play, I became more and more concerned about the ethics of historical storytelling. Obviously, the ethics of the beliefs held by the Civil War reenactors, but also my own ethics in presenting their verbatim words to an audience. I wondered about my ability to present their words with interrogation without simply amplifying their damaging ideas. I was lucky to connect early on with the renowned artist Dred Scott and to spend several years interviewing him as he prepared for and finally executed his own reenactment, which was a response to this hobby of historical reenacting. He staged a reenactment of a slave rebellion from 1811 in New Orleans. He spoke to me about how he was deeply interested in the experience of an audience who would be taking in his reenactment. He described his vision of the event. This was before it happened. He was describing what he was envisioning, which is what came to pass. This epic procession of a freedom march with his people in 19th century garb, 19th century weapons, marching through 20th century backdrop of, Domino's pizzas and oil refineries and trailer parks and gated communities and strip malls. There will be a profound cognitive dissonance for people seeing it. which I think will be great. And you know, for these people who are going to work at a pizza place, at a barber shop, and they see 500 armed black men in period clothing singing in Creole, it's going to be like, what the fuck am I seeing? And here's a picture from his ultimate reenactment, which is really amazing. And he said, even if you don't know a lot about this, you're going to have a really interesting conversation with your workmate. It'll be different from a lot of reenactment, which tries to sort of excise the present. So that was a really big difference in what he was doing. He was really interested in this conversation with audience, rather than historical reenactors who are like, there's no audience, there's nothing but us recreating history. He was aware, obviously, that every piece of historical storytelling is about the moment in which the person telling meets the person receiving. To that end, as I crafted How to Load a Musket, I wondered about how to address my own person and subjectivity in the curation of the piece. I wanted to acknowledge that these interviews were not conducted in a vacuum, that what was spoken to me by reenactors was spoken in the context of my presence, of my body, of my age, of my race and gender presentation. Ultimately, I chose to reckon with these questions by putting myself into the play, or rather, in a half-hearted gesture at fairness, putting an actor reenacting me in the play into the final scene. I presented a conversation between myself and Scott in which he had asked me questions about my own process as an interviewer. In our conversation, I described these ethical qualms that I'd been struggling with and the way it felt as an Armenian American to hear the word genocide used again and again in a context that felt deeply inaccurate and offensive. At the end of the conversation, Scott said to me, "There's a unity between what the reenactors are doing and what you're doing and what I'm doing. We're each fighting to show our vision of history. And in a certain sense, we're cherry picking what we find is important about that history." So what is important about history and what is authentic about history are two different questions, and casting, as noted, is a tough task, but it's also can often be an artistic opportunity. In Jacqueline Backhouse's raucous play, Men on Boats, based loosely on the journals of John Wesley Powell, it brings to life the voyage of a group of men under Powell's command charting the Colorado River in 1869. In her casting note for the play, which you can see in this photo, she wrote, "The characters in Men on Boats were historically cisgender white males, but the cast should be made up entirely of people who are not. I'm talking about racially diverse actors who are female-identifying, trans-identifying, gender-fluid, and/or gender non-conforming." She expounded for reasons for this casting. She said, "If we were forced to keep that sort of accuracy in the mainstream of history, we would really only be learning the stories of a select few individuals. It would just limit our scope entirely. One thing that I hope this show is able to do for people is to make them wonder about that, just by virtue of who was cast in it. Because this story does still fall into white male history, I hope that it serves as a gateway for people to start wondering what else there is to learn." So like Scott, Backhouse is thinking about audience here. At the end of the play, a group of the explorers wait uneasily for three of their company who have gone missing. A strange man, a character we've never seen in the play before, called Mr. Asa, approaches them. And he tries to reassure them because they seem really glum. Oops, I had that. He says, "You all look so glum. This is about you too for now. This is your moment. You rowed those boats. You made history. Hey, tell you what, I'll tell my children I met you all here on this bank. Here's where I was, I'll say. When those Powell folks clambered out of the canyon, wow, they'll say, wow. And the whole crew tipped their brims to me, I'll say. Wow, they'll say. And the whole crew came over and we fed them back to health. And we kept in touch with all of them, I'll say. They invited me to Washington, I'll say. They gave me a medal for rescuing the ones that made it out alive. I was the reason they all survived, I'll say. It was all because of me. Were they alive, they'll ask me? They were alive, I'll say. You were alive. This was your story." So in these final moments of the play, Backhouse is cleverly demonstrating the way that life becomes processed into history. Mr. Asa is saying some truth. They were alive. These were real people. The character in Backhouse's play were real people. But much of what Mr. Asa is saying is not true. He is not the reason they all survived, and there is no evidence that they invited him to Washington. He is a bystander who has appointed himself as the orator, as the person who is telling the story, changing it where he sees fit. In Mr. Asa's self-mythologizing record, as with the casting of the play, Backhouse demonstrates that truth in historical record is an illusion. How does casting Powell's play with non-cis male performers change an audience's experience and change how an audience thinks of this particular history? Something I've been wondering a lot about is if it makes a difference if the playwright can assume that the audience has familiarity with the history being told already. When I wrote The Good John Proctor, I was writing to an audience that I assumed had some familiarity with the names and the events of the Salem witch trials, mostly because the Crucible has made them so famous that I felt like I could assume some familiarity. But I think it's important to note that when Miller wrote his play in the 1950s, the names John Proctor and Abigail Williams meant little, if nothing, to anyone. So I wonder about audience expectation and general knowledge and how that changes the obligation of a playwright and what they're writing. This brings me inevitably to Hamilton, of course. Impossible to make this lecture and not speak about Hamilton. So Lin-Manuel Miranda's mega hit musical Hamilton, for those of you who've never heard of it, is certainly, obviously, the most famous modern day example of historical storytelling in theater. In Hamilton, Miranda musicalizes the story of the dual-dead founding father using soaring musical styles ranging from hip-hop to R&B to traditional musical theater. Like Men on Boats, Hamilton is aiming to subvert traditional historical storytelling through casting. In Miranda's musical, all the founding fathers and the women in their lives are cast with performers of color. They were all white people in history. In a feature in The New Yorker soon after the premiere of the show, the artistic director of the Public Theater, Oscar Eustis, described Hamilton's appeal. This is his quote. "What Lin is doing is taking the vernacular of the streets and elevating it to verse. That is what hip-hop is, and that is what iambic pentameter was." Lin is telling the story of the founding of his country in such a way as to make everyone present feel that they have a stake in their country. In heightened verse form, Shakespeare told England's national story to the audience at the Globe and helped make England England, helped give it its self-consciousness. This is exactly what Lin is doing with Hamilton. So, as I noted earlier, Shakespeare wrote most of his histories under Elizabeth I. Miranda wrote Hamilton under President Obama, who was delighted by Hamilton and raved, "The show reminds us that this nation was built by more than just a few great men and that it is an inheritance that belongs to all of us." Similarly to Miller in his writing on The Crucible, Miranda's early press on Hamilton emphasizes the depth of his research and his quest for accuracy in the text of the musical. The same New Yorker article talks about Ron Chernow, who met with Miranda a few months before the White House performance, became a historical consultant on the show. Lin never gratuitously invents anything, Chernow said. He tries first to stick to the facts, and if he has to deviate from the facts, I have found that there is always a very good reason for him doing it. I said to him, "Do you want me to tell you when I see historical errors?" And he said, "Absolutely, I want the historians to respect this." As you can see, I'm really interested not just in history and plays, but also the way that playwrights talk about their process and the accuracy of their history in press, which I've had to do too, and it's terrifying. But I think it ultimately builds to become part of the narrative of what this play is and what it's doing. So shortly after its debut on the scene, however, Hamilton began to receive a slew of backlash, specifically for the ways in which the show's colorblind casting erases rather than illuminates the history the show is claiming to portray. In his essay entitled "Why Hamilton is Not the Revolution You Think It Is," James McMaster wrote, "Progressive audiences seem to want to read Hamilton, complete with its multiracial ensemble, as a production that is politically copacetic with this contemporary racial revolution. However, in Hamilton, the fact that the white men who founded the United States, colonizers all, slaveholders some, are played by men of color actually obfuscates histories of racialized violence in the United States. Case in point, in Cabinet Battle I, when the talented Daveed Diggs argues as Thomas Jefferson for the security of the South's slaveholding economy, the actor's blackness visually distances his performance of racism from Jefferson's whiteness, enabling a largely white audience to forget the degree to which they are implicated in the violent anti-black histories of the United States." To me, one of the most fascinating criticisms of Hamilton came in the form of another full-length play, written as a response to the musical. In 2019, the playwright Ishmael Reed debuted a play entitled "The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda." In a sort of satirical homage to Charles Dickens, it's an amazing photo, A Christmas Carol. Reed features a procession of ghosts haunting a wide-eyed Lin-Manuel Miranda, including Harriet Tubman, several slaves owned by Hamilton's in-laws, and Native Americans who are not featured in the musical. After witnessing a reading of Reed's play, the writer Hua Shu in The New Yorker described his experience. He wrote, "At the public reading, the play's brusque polemical energy felt like a throwback to a different time, perhaps to an earlier version of multiculturalism, one that was dissenting and hostile, aspiring to trouble the mainstream rather than enter it. If Hamilton is subversive," Reed asks, "what is it subverting? Though the musical overthrew Broadway orthodoxy with its casting and music, the version of history that it presents is arguably quite old-fashioned, despite its success in making that history seem hipper. Rags to riches stories celebrate exceptions, distracting us from the crookedness of a system that dooms the rest to misery." I'm really struck by the meta-theatricality of Reed's play. Like the sheep in Ajmi's Marie Antoinette, the ghosts in The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda are an immediate tip-off that this is not a traditional history play. But Lin-Manuel Miranda is a real person, and in imagining him and his creative process while reminding us of another true historical narrative, Reed writes a different sort of history, one in which the history Miranda is examining is portrayed differently. It becomes delightfully meta, the history of a history play meeting history. So Reed's work makes me think, of course, about The Crucible again and my ongoing obsession with it. In the archives in Texas, Tavi and I came across a series of drafts of an unpublished essay that Miller wrote entitled On Marilyn. In this essay, Miller reflects on his relationship with Marilyn Monroe, which began as an extramarital affair. He contemplates her physical appeal, the origins of their relationship, and the guilt he felt. Not so much over his lust for her as over his sort of public association with such a sexualized person. In The Crucible, John Proctor confesses his affair with Abigail to the court, exclaiming, "God help me, I lusted, and there is promise in such sweat, but it is a whore's vengeance." So, there's an argument to be made that all of Miller's plays hinge on the same question. Can we believe in the inherent goodness of a man who has been tempted by lust? Right, in The Crucible, John Proctor is racked with guilt over his affair with Abigail. In Death of a Salesman, Biff, the son of the salesman Willie Loman, discovers his father having an affair with a receptionist, which is like the catalyst for his loss of joy and ambition and the rupturing of the Loman family. In View from the Bridge, the longshoreman Eddie Carbone is consumed by sexual longing for his wife's niece, who is approaching her 18th birthday. In Miller's play After the Fall, he engages with this theme again, but this time there is a sort of historical narrative at play, as you can see, from a very different ilk than The Crucible. After the Fall centers on a New York City Jewish intellectual, much like Miller himself, who is re-examining the romantic relationships of his life, especially his marriage with Maggie, a famous performer who is plagued by addiction and alcoholism and ultimately takes her own life. Today, I think we would call this autofiction. In the original production, as you can see, Barbara Loden, the actress playing Maggie, wore a platinum blonde wig, which rendered her a dead ringer for the dead Monroe. The Crucible is Miller's history of the Salem witch trials. After the Fall is Miller's history of his own love life. Like Abigail Williams, Marilyn Monroe was a real person. And Miller was debatably more qualified to write about Marilyn's history, having been married to her for 5 years. But After the Fall, which premiered in New York a mere 2 years after Monroe's death, came under vicious critique pretty much immediately. The ethics of Marilyn's history being presented on stage were immediately called into question. Was it because Marilyn had lived more recently that people were so outraged? Was her memory more sacred than that of Abigail Williams, who had vanished into obscurity several centuries before? Or did After the Fall receive such intense criticism simply because it was an inferior play? There was a conversation that Tavi and I also found in the archives that's really amazing, and I wish I could feature it here, but I'm not allowed to quote directly. But it's a conversation between the director, Mike Nichols, the playwright Lillian Hellman, and the writer, James Baldwin. I don't know where it's from. It's a transcript. They are discussing After the Fall, and they are ripping it apart. It really has, some great, Twitter vibes. And It's really fascinating, and they are careful to make the distinction that they do not think it was unethical of Miller to write about Marilyn Monroe. What they consider unethical, unforgivable, in fact, is that he did so poorly. Their quarrel is not with the content, but with the art of the play itself. So Hilary Mantel, who died just last year, wrote, "As soon as we die, we enter into fiction." Now, I think about Miller, who is no longer alive and certainly fictitious to me in his unknowability, asking the same question over and over again in his work, and I wonder what the question is that I'm asking. Right now, I'm writing a play about the Armenian American community's relationship to identity and to whiteness. The first part of the play takes place over the course of a 1925 trial in which Tatas Kartosian, an Armenian man whose US citizenship was revoked, is fighting to be counted as a white man so that he can formally naturalize in accordance with the US laws of the time. In the play, I imagine Kartosian's family, as you can see, preparing for the trial with their lawyer, and I'm trying to be as accurate as possible. I'm using the court transcripts that I've read and the research that I've done to understand the family and the mindset of Armenian Americans in the 1920s, which was just a few years after the genocide. But of course, already I can tell that I'm playing and I'm shifting and I'm shuffling my notes and cherry picking and changing things to suit the story that is most interesting to me to tell. And I'm curious about if this play, which is like inevitably going to be like a 3-hour-long interrogation of whiteness and Armenian American identities from the 1920s to the age of the Kardashians, if it will ever be produced or if it's uncastable, or if enough people would be interested in hearing a story about the descendants of a country that is now pretty unknown thanks to a fairly successful genocide. Which is, of course, the point for me, to make it interesting and to make it known. I think the question that I'm asking in Jane Anger and The Good John Proctor and How to Load a Musket has always had something to do with this, with the allure of almost erased histories and with the potential of a footnote. So that's why I'm writing the new play, and to echo Miller, that's why I write plays in general. Thank you.